Yeah, so we were featured on Hodinkee. So when I first saw the article, I was taken aback, for real, to be quite honest. So you might be like me and think to yourself, well, you know, I've been following Steel City for quite a while now, and they've sold a lot of really cool watches. So what is it about this one in particular, and why is this one the one that was featured? These past couple of months have honestly been a huge blessing. I mean, it's been an absolutely amazing ride. I've had, in the span of 6 weeks, 2 watches that, in my opinion, are the grail, you know, top example in terms of configuration for 2 very important references, and 2 references that hold a place close to my heart. So the first of which being two-tone Vacheron steel and pink gold reference 4073 that we'll get into in a different video, and then this Patek 96. So, you know, if you're like me, you might be thinking to yourself, what is it about this watch that got them featured on Hodinkee? I've been following Steel City for a long time. I find a lot of the watches that, you know, they've offered and curated for their watch shop to be very interesting. What is it about this specifically? And I honestly think it's a combination of a number of different things that got this watch to pop off more so than other offerings that we've had. I think first you start off with the name, right? Patek. So being associated as part of the big 3, not only in Swiss watchmaking, but in, you know, the watch industry as a whole, is a great starting place. But then you go a little bit further and, you know, it's a 96. So we won't get into the history of the 96. That's been covered extensively, both in video format and in literature itself. There was a whole book written just on the reference itself, but just like a little snippet, it is an important reference for the brand. The 96 at the time period that it was released was a little bit of a turning point, if you will, and I think this played a big role in that, in the watchmaking world, in the sense that up until that point in time, wristwatches were primarily worn by women. Men were still, you know, accustomed to using pocket watches, and, you know, the wristwatches were kind of looked at as a little bit more feminine, you know, at that time period, and you know, wasn't really something that was embraced by the men who were purchasing watches at the time. And the time period that it was released was right after they were bought out by a different, you know, company, or family rather. So this was their introduction, you know, that we purchased Patek. They're now under a different ownership, and here's what, you know, they offered. So it was pretty much the first serially produced wristwatch, you know, and accepted and loved by men and women alike. So I think that also plays a role. You know, it's a very staple wristwatch that went on to be produced for many decades and then replaced by pretty much iterations that were very similar with incremental upgrades. So an important reference, one that whose case itself, you know, remains an icon, very much so, just like a Cartier tank in the round format. So, you know, I've said it again, and it's not my example, but it is an example that I think really holds water and kind of hits the nail on the head, in the sense that if you were to look at, you know, a watch and, you know, asked to draw it, this is the watch that you would draw. It just has that classic shape, that Bauhaus principle mindset where form follows function. And the case maker, Antoine Gerlach, you really nailed it. It's something that never goes in and out of style. It's just always constant. But like I said, it's a couple of tiers down. So we have the important name, we have the important reference, but then getting into this specific reference in terms of configuration, it is a rare variant. I don't know exactly how many are produced. There's many speculation out there. I would say probably, the literature and most people would agree that it's probably less than 100 examples in terms of the case metal itself, rose gold, and the dial, black. So those two in combination, probably less than 100 made. So an absolutely really rare watch. Typically, most people would argue that in terms of total production for any reference, vintage, obviously speaking about vintage, if there's 90% of the whole total production, most, that 90% would be in yellow gold, and then maybe like another, 7% in rose gold, and then, 3% for platinum, white gold, steel, and other maybe one-off pieces. So the metal itself for a 96 makes it rare, but then, one step further, you get into the dial. So it's a black dial, and one thing that Rich didn't cover in his article, and it was a magnificent article, and I'm honored to be featured in it. But one thing that he didn't mention, and that many people I don't think talked about enough, is not all black dials are the same. Even in the 96, there were dials that were pad printed, there were dials that were done in enamel. And then we have this example specifically that was a gilt technique. So, from a manufacturing standpoint, enamel dials, gilt dials, I'm sure they're probably pretty comparable in terms of how difficult and time consuming they are to manufacture. But they yield a different aesthetic. It's a completely different aesthetic on the wrist when you're looking at it, under loupe and everything like that. It's not the same looking dial when you're handling it. And I believe that part was a little bit overlooked by many people. The gilt technique itself, I'm not a dial manufacturer, obviously, but as I understand the process, you start off with a plate. It's usually a brass plate or copper plate, just a base metal plate. In this specific instance, I would think that it's copper. It has that tone to it, and it kind of matches the case. And that plate itself is polished to a mirror finish. And then in this case, the outer minute track, so that what we refer to as a railroad track, the signature itself, and then the track around the subseconds is put on with a special type of ink. And then at that point, they take a layer of paint that's galvanized and they apply it, in this case black, and they apply it to the dial. Finally, the special ink that those tracks were done and the signature was done is washed off, and essentially what you're revealing is the base plate below with the outline of the track and the minute signature and the subsidiary seconds track. You're revealing that plate, and that's what you're seeing. So it's a really cool 3D effect. Like when you're looking at it, the minute track and the signature itself is sunken into the dial. And what I love about it most is when you're outside, or if you're inside and you're under the right light and you're kind of tilting your wrist to get the reflection off of the light, it hits that base plate, and because it's a brass plate or a copper plate that's been mirror polished, it reflects the light so brilliantly. It's an absolute marvel to look at. So in terms of a 96, which is a very popular reference, it's a reference that kind of ebb and flowed in popularity, but it always kind of remained somewhat stable. There was always a general interest in it because of its aesthetics, because of its historical importance, not to mention the movement underneath, which came in I believe 4 series, but you know, especially once it transitioned to that, you know, 2nd through 4th series, it is an absolute marvel to look at. You know, I'm not the most technically proficient guy from a movement standpoint, but I appreciate aesthetics, and who honestly, who doesn't? But it has an amazing looking movement that's just, you know, really nice to see when you're able to take that case back off. And you know, in portrait reference like that, to be able to have a grail example, you know, as often as the good ones go, you know, I got it in, and it sold very quickly, which, you know, I wish I would have had you know, some more time with it before it sold. But you know, no one's going to be obviously unhappy that one of the watches that they curated for their shop sold so quickly. But yeah, we ended up taking it back. The gentleman who originally bought it, it was his first dive into vintage watches, and he wasn't aware of the size. It's 30.5 millimeters, 31 millimeters. So if you're used to modern watches, yeah, it's definitely kind of a surprising, you know, it's a shock when you get it on and you're like, oh, this is kind of small. But for people like me, or people who just love vintage watches in general, I think that's part of the charm. So we did end up getting it back, and my plan was to always do a video on it, and then you know, I was going to use this video to tell you guys it was available again, but it sold again, as often the good ones do.